Hello, Kyama.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
How is Nairobi?
Oh, Nairobi is good. Yeah.
Let me let you introduce yourself.
Yeah. So my name is Kyama Mugambi, but if I'm introducing myself in a meeting among Africans, and I know not everyone our audience will spread beyond Africa, I would say I am Bogo Kyama Digai Wandwega wa Kanywa wa Mugambi. That's all in all, some like 7 names right there that sort of locate me exactly where I come from. But yeah, I'm Kyama Mugambi. I'm a Christian. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a teacher, and I'm a pastor. From a background of Anglican, being an Anglican, but now in a charismatic Pentecostal community. And someone will say, well, but it seems like there's a contradiction. In this part of the world, there's no contradiction. In this part of the world, the two go very well together. Okay. Yeah, and so that's me. A little bit about my family. I'm married. We have 3 children. And I have 5 siblings, and my parents are teachers. Mm-hmm. And as it goes, in our continent, my dad is a teacher. My mom is a teacher. In fact, my dad is a theologian, and some of the audience may have read him, J.N.K. Mugambi. Most people know him for one of 3 things. First of all, he was known for theology in Africa, theology and African culture, which was a primary area of his concern in the 1970s and the 1980s. Interestingly, his PhD was actually not in African Christianity. His PhD was in philosophy, and yeah. So he read Wittgenstein. So yeah, but those were tools that he used, and he was in the philosophy and religious studies department. He used those tools to help begin to open up the conversation about Africa, African culture, and Christianity. That's the first thing he's known for. In the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s, into the 1990s, he came to be known for the theology of Reconstruction, together with a number of other authors, some of whom were his students, some of whom were his contemporaries and colleagues. And then more recently, one of the areas that he focused on, which was a major area in his reflections on theology of Reconstruction, is in theology and environment in the African context. And so that's something that he also looked into. He's an ecumenist, very concerned about how the different traditions come together, even though he's an avowed Anglican. And so that's something that has somehow spoken into my life in one way or another. So that's the heritage that I come from. And like I like to say, my dad has big shoes, and it's intimidating just having a conversation about about theology and about African Christianity with people looking over my shoulder to see my dad. And we had a conversation once with him, and said, your shoes are very big for me to fit into. And he said, you don't have to fit in my shoes, just find your own shoes. And and so that was a very gracious way, a few years ago, of his blessing me into what I've been doing. And I feel that he has really just given me a push in many, many ways.
Mm. And how about your PhD work?
Had been thinking for a long time. I did my master's in the early 2000s after getting into church work, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I was very interested in the church and aspects of the urban church, what the church is becoming today. You know, if you're looking at Philip Jenkins and Todd Johnson,
Sure.
And others who are watching closely what's going on with Christianity around the world, asking myself what are some of the elements of this African urban Christianity. And the one that I settled on was leadership for purposes of a PhD. And so I studied. I wanted to bring two strands of my background. One strand is church work, you know, having studied and worked in church and being a pastor within a church. And then the other strand that I wanted to bring together was a strand of leadership and the management sciences, which I had studied. And so I wrote my PhD thesis on leadership development in Pentecostal churches, a particular kind of Pentecostal church known as the Progressive Pentecostal Church, which is progressive not because of its theology, but really progressive because of its praxis. And so that's what my PhD study was. I did it at the Center for World Christianity at Africa International University, and it's one of very few centers on the continent that actually reflect on world Christianity. And so its director is Mark Shaw, who's a historian, and so it has a historical, you know, bent to it. But it is very much a multidisciplinary, and so there's several of us who have come from that. One of the more better known former students, is Wanjiro Gitau, who is in the social sciences. She's a sociologist who incorporates quite a bit of anthropology in her writing, and recently wrote a book, Mega Churches Reconsidered, looking at world Christianity, looking at African urban Christianity, a particular strand of African urban Christianity, from a sociological perspective. And so we are like that. I came in with a church pastoral and management science perspective, and still I'm attached to them, to the Center for World Christianity as an associate researcher.
When did you finish your PhD?
I finished my PhD in 2017.
Okay.
2017 graduated.
Good.
Yeah.
And you've talked about your work in the church.
Yes.
And how it then shapes your PhD.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. So after studying management in undergraduate, I felt the call to join church ministry, and I was already involved in Pentecostal church in Nairobi. And so, you know, I joined the church and joined the staff, and began working there on the pastoral team, and have been since for a couple of decades now. My role initially, my entry into the church initially was in the management or putting together of the Sunday experiences, the Sunday worship experiences. And that had to do with a bit of my, you know, management science background, as well as my music background, because that also somehow has a place in my history. And so so I joined in that capacity, and after working for several years, it became clear to me that I wanted to engage a little bit more with young people, what I like to call the next generations. And that led me into church planting. And so, you know, having joined the church, you know, was involved in
and this is Mavuno, right?
I joined the Nairobi Chapel. The Nairobi Chapel planted Mavuno. I joined the Mavuno planting team, and planted a church within Mavuno very early in the life of Mavuno in 2006. And then in 2009, 2010, then joined a team, a senior leadership team, now not as a church planter, but as a facilitator of church planters. And so, and that I did that, for a number of years. I did that for 5-6 years, and stepped out of that and let the next generation pick up that responsibility of training church planters. And so I'm now still involved with the church as a pastor at large, still giving capacity in terms of theological training, in terms of mentoring church planters, and strategic roles that emerge. In addition to just doing normal pastoral work, what pastors do, we preach, we pray for people, we pray for children when they are born, we join people together in marriage, we grieve with them when we lose loved ones, and we answer difficult questions such as COVID-19.
Sure.
and walk through life with people, and that's a calling of mine, which I combine together with my teaching and other academic activities.
Say something about your musical background.
Yeah, well, I come from a musical family. My parents love music. My mom loves music, and so I guess it just got into us, into the six of us. And so I, at an early age, picked up music instruments to play, and through high school, picked up 2 instruments, classical violin and piano, and carried on with those. And when I joined university, I didn't see myself becoming a professional musician, but very much wanted to use those gifts within a church context for worship. And so I ended up being involved within the church, playing instruments, leading bands, writing music, doing live worship recordings. And later on in life, graduated from being on the front line of that to mentoring musicians, and just speaking into their lives and encouraging them to do what God has called them to do. So I've been involved in many bands, many worship bands, and so on, with many people who have led the music, and most recently being involved with the Q band.
Wow. You wear so many hats.
Well, it's a dynamic life. There's a thread that brings everything together, and I think someone listening to me may see this as very different things. They're actually all related. My passion and call in life is to see the role of Christian faith in the life of the urban African Christian, the young African urban Christian. So that next generation, what does Christ mean for them in their life? And so that filters out for me in music, it will filter out for me in my studies. That's what I do as a pastor. I focus on that generation. That's what I do when I'm teaching in the university. And that is what I do even when I'm writing, even some of the material that I have written. Yeah.
By the way, I saw your blog on COVID-19.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That was really good. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah. Every once in a while, I'll write articles for my blog, radicalimpact.wordpress.com, and it's a way of speaking to that generation. So anyone reading that blog will see that there's a certain group of people I'm talking to. Sure. And that's my core audience that I'm looking for.
Awesome. So let's go back a bit and talk about your PhD process. Your research questions, your research methodology, and your research findings.
So of course, when I was clear that I wanted to do a PhD, I went and sat down with the head of department, who then became my supervisor naturally. And there's any number of ways we could have gone about it, because when you talk about the urban church in Africa, there's many things you can talk about. And the work, my understanding of what a PhD is supposed to do, the PhD is supposed to open a line of inquiry, which you then get yourself involved in a very disciplined way. And so when I came in, I had thoughts and feelings. Sure. Thoughts and feelings about the church, thoughts and feelings about leadership, and so on. And so the question that my supervisor asked is, what is it about leadership that is problematic, or that can be distilled into something you can look into? And I went and had some reflection about that. And I said, the problem in my mind was that we have there's a leadership problem in Pentecostal churches. Pentecostals and Charismatic are the fastest growing group of Christians anywhere in the world. They grow many times faster than other types of Christianity. But in Africa, the big thing that we have a problem with is the leadership of these communities. That's what we say. We say that they're bad leaders. Their theology is not right. They're swindling people out of money. They're doing fake miracles and so on. And when you ask people, is it the faith that is wrong? Is it the churches that are bad? Is it the members that are bad? Everyone will point and say the problem is the leaders. And so that's the feeling that I had. And so we had to distill that into something that you can research. It's not enough just to say you feel bad about the leaders. That doesn't produce good scholarship. It produces brilliant journalism, but it's
bad scholarship.
But bad scholarship.
That's right.
And so I've seen a number of scholarly papers where people are complaining about the leadership, and that sometimes for me reads more like journalism than it is
sure.
than it is scholarship. So anyway, so together with my supervisor, we distilled what it was I sensed the issue was. The issue was the leadership, and the issue was how you arrive at leadership in these communities. Okay. How are leaders developed? Because it seems to be a problem. The problem seems to be what's the formation process for the leaders that ends up producing fruit that is not good fruit.
Sure.
And so, because once we settled on leadership development as an area of study, everything else for me then fell very quickly. Because I then asked myself, okay, what can I study? I can study the bad leadership, or I can go the opposite of the grain and say, can I find one or two examples that we can study of community, Pentecostal, charismatic communities that are able to produce good leaders? And then I study them, and I study their history. I study these particular leaders. I look at their theology. I look at their sermons. I look at their process, and try to find out what is it that they're doing right. And so that's the approach that I do. So in all of that, what I'm doing is that I'm giving you a picture of the problem, mm-hmm. And the research questions, because the problem and the research questions, that's how sure. That's the trajectory that it took. And I chose to study these communities because I distilled 3 communities which are from different histories, and used those as the study study examples, case studies, I think is what we call them, as the case studies. And I said, I'm going to do those because those are the rarity in the public narrative. There are obviously, churches that are good and that are developing leaders, but in the public narrative, if you open any newspaper on a Monday morning, newspapers on Monday mornings tend to want to focus on the negativity of the church, I think.
Sure.
And so you're going to see numerous examples of bad leadership. So I said, okay, let me go find some good leaders, or churches with good leaders, good second and third generation leaders. And then I find out what's the process of coming to that. So that's my problem. That's my research question.
Sure.
That's how it came about. Because of the subject matter, my case studies were not hard to find because they're so few.
They stand out.
Yeah, they just stand out. I mean, Nairobi, you have, 10 churches, probably 10, 12 churches.
Okay.
Charismatic Pentecostal churches or church families, let me call them church families,
sure,
where I could trace and say, I have a trackable, what do you call it, like a trackable progression of leadership development.
Sure.
I mean, there are hundreds of good churches, big and small, but the ones that you can go in and are old enough, 20, 25 years, 30 years, old enough for you to actually see 1, 2, 3 generations of leaders. Sure. Those were fewer. And so that helped me narrow down, because the thing about PhD is that I think, I forget now that it's my supervisor who said, with a PhD, you take a field of knowledge, like a big circle, and then you slice that circle into a thin wedge, a particular area of knowledge. Then you take that thin wedge and then you slice it even more, so that you can, really just get into in-depth on a very particular thing. People studying the church in Africa don't have to slice so much, because there's still so much left to be studied.
Sure.
Still so much left to be studied. I took 3 churches as case studies. There's a whole bunch of other churches I left.
Are you able to mention the 3 churches?
Yes, sure. Definitely. So I focused on the Nairobi Chapel.
Okay.
Which is a denomination I had left and entered into Mavuno. Still, within the same family of churches, same tradition. I took Christ is the Answer Ministry, which is what's the Canadian Pentecostal Assemblies of God.
All right. Okay.
That's the history. That's the history line, but it's now actually an indigenous community. Actually, it's quite large, with something over 15 different congregations spread out all over the country and all over the continent. And then I took International Christian Church, which is out of the American Assemblies of God. That's the history, that's the missionary history. But again, it's part of the Kenyan Pentecostal Assemblies of God, which is an indigenous, local denomination.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so I took those 3, and I selected them because all of them have multiple church plants. All of them have multiple generations of leadership. All of them are no longer being led, are no longer connected in any significant way with their founding missionary agencies, or the founding history.
Sure.
And so I found that they would be good case studies.
And what was the process like? The methodology itself. How did you?
Okay, so I took a case study methodology.
Sure.
and as is the case with a complex subject, when you have a very straightforward subject, then you have a few more options. With a complex subject, multiple subjects. When you have one, then you can narrow down. You can use particular methodologies, historical methodologies, and so on. Well, when you have 3, and then they are all fairly complex entities in and of themselves. Then I found that the case study was the best. Initially, I had looked at portraiture, which is like an in-depth descriptive methodology. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, well, it's good, but it will require a lot more in-depth, looking into the thing and locked within its current setting. But I wanted to look at some of the historical material. I wanted to look at the organizationally, bring in my management sciences approach. And I also wanted to have, to incorporate stories and to incorporate, conversations. And so I used the case study methodology, which is a sort of a composite methodology, almost like a little bit like grounded research, but now with case studies. And so that's what I did. The core of my research was in in-depth interviews that I did. And so I did 30 in-depth interviews, backed those up with questionnaires. And so I did a management, I went and procured a management science questionnaire, which then, we used with the respondents. And then I did in-depth interviews, long, asking lots of in-depth questions, probing into the issues, talking about leadership development, talking about history, talking about the leader's own personal journey of leadership. In some instances, I did multiple interviews where I had to go back and ask the question again. Because it's a case study, I also went and did observation. I went and did unstructured observation of the communities. What does the space look like? What does it tell me about leadership? What do people do? I went to the services. What is the service like? What does that tell me about leadership? I looked into their materials, what they use to train their leaders. What are those like? Do they have processes? And so on. I looked into their constitutions. I looked for the constitutions and I looked into those. I looked into historical material, which was not even related with the church. So for example, if a church was registered before independence by non-Kenyans, I went and found out who are those people that planted the church. Who are they as leaders? What does that say about the organization? So I looked at all of that. So it was fairly broad, but all of those were housed within the case study methodology. Sure. And the centerpiece of that was the interview, the in-depth interview.
How long did this take you?
Okay. So the whole PhD, together with the writing up to the submission of the thesis for examination, up to the defense, took me 3.5 years.
Yes, but I'm asking about the actual research itself, the going about looking for materials and da.
Okay, so as soon as I settled on the topic and managed to do a preliminary research for the proposal,
sure.
I would say it took me about a year and a half.
Okay.
A year and a half. Gathering the materials and the interviews, that was easy. 30 interviews. They all live in Nairobi.
Sure.
2 of the people don't live in Nairobi. I had phone interviews with them. So the interviews, that didn't take a lot of time. Sure. What took time was gathering all the material around it, and then the analysis. The analysis took a while. Yeah. The analysis and writing.
Any challenges and surprises?
Yeah. Definitely. Challenges, of course, it's quite something as an African, knowing our hierarchical culture, to go and sit down with a bishop and ask the bishops what did not go right in their churches. So that's there's a cultural thing, because in many of our cultures we do not we do not highlight weaknesses, or at least a leader cannot highlight the weaknesses of his community. Sure. He cannot betray his own community to, quote unquote, an outsider. Okay. I mean, that's a little easier for me from the Nairobi chapel, because I'm a child of the, sure. But it's a little harder from outside. But they were gracious. And they were honest and open about what worked, what hadn't worked, what hadn't been tested, because in a way these are some of young. So that was a challenge. Another challenge was writing it up.
Okay.
Composing, as one of my friends likes to call it, composing the text is difficult, and part of it has to do with language, part of it has to do with time. I think the African scholar is just faced with certain challenges that are not usual for some people in other parts of the world. I mean, I'm a husband, I'm a father. That's not different with other people. But I'm also a pastor. The church has demands on me. My extended family have demands on me, and the extended family is really extended. It's my siblings, it's my cousins, it's my wife's siblings, it's my wife's cousins, because we're all tied together in that community. And so that presented some challenges in terms of the time to compose, sit down and compose all of this. And then later
you mentioned language before we move on from this. Yes. You mentioned language as well. Can you just
language? That has become very very obvious to me in the last few days as I have gone on to write my postdoctoral project, because for many of us, English is a second, third, in my case, fourth language, and so that the other languages that I have spoken, one person would say interfere, but I got a better word the other day. I mediate my thinking and my writing through the thought forms and the concepts that were there before. I mean, you notice when I introduced myself, I gave myself a full introduction.
Sure.
So that framework of thinking, how I identify myself, my sense of identity, my way of thinking, how I process the realities that come to me, find their way in how I write in my English. So my English to someone who speaks a Bantu language might actually make sense, but someone who doesn't speak that kind of language might find the sentence construction a little unusual, and so on. So my thesis was examined by a non-African, and so I needed to make sure that what I write is clear.
Sure.
And so language, I mean language in that sort of way.
Okay.
So it's both a challenge, but I think it's an opportunity, because in being able to articulate myself clearly, I might be able to communicate other thought forms or other concepts to other people who may not be familiar.
To a wider audience as well. Brilliant.